Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our conversation with Brian Corr. We're so happy to have you all here. I'll take a second to introduce myself, Catherine Carr-Kelly. I am the Executive Director of Central Square Theater. We are here with Deborah Wise, Artistic Director of Underground Railway at Central Square Theater.
Hello.
And our special guest, Brian Corr.
Good evening. Thank you.
Let me start off by saying that we welcome your questions tonight. We so hope this is a conversation between all of us and not just the three of us. So please use the Q&A function for the webinar. I think you'll see it at the bottom of your screen. So Q&A, use that and we'll periodically check it as we go along. So I'd like to start off by just talking a little bit about Brian because we're really happy to have him with us tonight. And he's had lots of really great experience and done lots of terrific work in Cambridge and nationally. Brian Corr is the immediate past president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, which is a nonprofit organization that works to enhance fair and professional law enforcement responsive to community needs, increase accountability and transparency in policing, and build community trust through civilian oversight. Brian has worked as Executive Director of the Peace Commission, which is how we know him best, for the City of Cambridge since April 2008. I think we may be one of the few cities that actually has a Peace Commission too. And since September 2010, he's also been the Director of the city's Police Review and Advisory Board, which conducts civilian oversight of the Cambridge Police Department. Brian is also, full disclosure, a new member of the Central Square Theater Board of Directors.
So Brian, how many cities or towns in the US have peace commissions? Do you know? I'm curious since Kathy brought that up.
Well, I do in fact know. There's Cambridge, and there's also New Haven, Connecticut, and Berkeley, California.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay. The three peaceful cities.
I don't have a lot of peers.
Well, before joining the Central Square Theater Board, we worked together often, many times actually, because of your leadership with the Peace Commission. For those people who know the work of Central Square Theater, I'll just mention a couple. With Tijon and His Brothers by Derek Walcott. We worked together. That was presented a year after the crisis, the earthquake in Haiti, and related to work in many ways with the Cambridge Haiti Sister City Project. With The Mountaintop by Katori Hall, for which you, thank you very much, Brian connected us with leaders in local movements for social justice inspired by Dr. King's work, movements for racial justice, also for economic justice, for disability rights, for gender equality, for LGBTQ rights. So theater is certainly an art form that invites conversation. Guy France, who was one of the artists with whom we worked with on Tijon and His Brothers, told us, in fact, that he realized after his collaboration with us that perhaps theater is useful to the extent that it can be a safe space for dangerous conversations. I always remembered that, thought that was very, very provocative and useful. And theater is also about the power of the imagination, right? Not only to fantasize, but also to expand our image of what is possible. And that brings us together in the theater, and it brings us together here. So after that framing, Brian, to connect this conversation with our enterprise of the theater, really want to thank you again for being here and to have a conversation inspired by two thoughtful and personal essays that you recently wrote. They're short, to the point. We wondered if you wouldn't mind reading the first one.
First of all, thank you, Deborah, for the kind words and for this opportunity. It has been really great to work with all of you at Central Square Theater, and I'm so glad that we have this opportunity to talk. But let me just jump right in and share this. So this was written on June 5th. And the title is, But Does My Black Life Matter? So yes, Black Lives Matter, but does my Black life matter? Before you comment, reply, repost, or share, please read this entire piece. It's brief. I'm not asking if you care about me, respect me, like me, or value my life and want me to live. I'm asking if you see me, if you hear me, and if you value me and my life without thinking about what it means for and about you. A few days ago here in Cambridge, just a couple of blocks from my house, I walked past a white family, 2 parents, 2 children, who were writing Black Lives Matter in multicolored chalk in the street and on the sidewalk, including one parent artfully and carefully placing those 3 words in big bold letters between the crosswalk lines. Quite dramatic. They were wearing masks, but I could still see their smiles. And they were clearly enjoying their activity, which is fine. It's great. And as I walked around them and by them, since they were in the street and on the sidewalk, I tried to make eye contact with each of them, even slowing down to admire their work, hoping to catch someone's eye. Not a single one made eye contact. They basically looked right through me. Steps from my house in liberal Cambridge, Massachusetts, I remain an invisible man. Black lives matter, but does my Black life matter? I see a lot of emails, articles, and posts about the need to follow Black leadership. And I don't know if I count as a Black leader in Cambridge or in anything or anywhere else, but here's what I need you to hear. And I'm going to speak plainly and be blunt. Don't strategize about how you can identify and choose Black people in organizations to bring in so that they can help you build a stronger movement. Acknowledge your privilege, and we all have privilege, and take a stand and speak your truth from where you are as who you are. If you're white, you will get criticized for having mostly liberal white people doing whatever it is you're doing, but that's far better than being seen as white people who want to make their own well-meaning plans and then have lots of diversity and more numbers by inviting Black folks in. Case in point, a white friend reached out to me as a friend and a fellow traveler in Work for Justice to ask my thoughts and advice earlier this week. And again, this was written early June. He didn't come up with a list of Black people, quote, who would be great to get if we can figure out who knows them, end quote. I appreciate being asked, and I was happy to be of support. The last point, and the most important thing I'll say on this is, a related issue is that there's a lot of talk in general right now about following Black leadership, which is good in the abstract. That starts by showing up in allyship for what others are doing. But always beware the temptation to choose which Black people to follow and then using your privilege to promote them. I saw that increasingly when the Black Lives Matter movement started locally a few years ago. And many privileged people, including people I know well, chose to support and elevate them over other voices and other Black people because Black Lives Matter had the right message, often without even realizing that they were using their privilege to validate and support the people that they thought were right. So I say this again, and I need you to hear me in the context of what I've just shared. Black lives matter, but does my Black life matter? I'm being very direct here because the times we're in demand it. The deeper issue here is one that I have been experiencing intensely over the last few years as a Black man living and working in Cambridge, which I love, and which I know that I am very lucky and very privileged to live here. I don't intend to be targeting anyone here, but I need you to hear my experiences and my truth. In peace and solidarity, and with love, Brian Corr.
Well, thanks, Brian. So here I am trying to understand your words in the context in which they are delivered. And see how quickly you can have an impact. You ask them to do something and they try to do it. It's great.
That's great.
Try to do it. So I was rereading this today. I was wondering if I would love to hear you speak, if you don't mind, a little bit more about your thought process. I mean, this is a personal essay, and I love the way you start with this personal experience, which becomes a kind of a metaphor. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about how your thought processes took you from your personal encounter with this family drawing on the sidewalk, your experience of them looking through you, ironically, right, while writing Black Lives Matter in front of your house, to the articulation of your hope that white people seeking to be involved in anti-racist work speak from their own truth and work in allies, if I'm understanding you correctly.
No, yes, I think that's correct. And it's complicated. And part of my message in this piece and a subsequent piece and what I've said to people who've asked me is that it needs to be complicated. It needs to be challenging and difficult. I can say a little bit more about that as we go on. But I think what my experience of this was, you know, there's this moment, right? So I'm telling a story, so I want to have a little drama. And that was also a dramatic moment for me. And when I passed that family and had that experience, it really kind of stirred me up. And I just kept thinking, why is that? I mean, I've been passing Black Lives Matter signs and chalk on the sidewalk and t-shirts for days now. But what was different about this? And what I realized was two things. One, it wasn't really that different. There were just some people there and they didn't see me, as it were. But the other thing is that as much as I believe most people are really putting this message out there, saying Black Lives Matter, to be supportive, to do all the things that people have said white people need to do to undo racism, there's an element of it that really is about them. And this is one of the bigger issues about race in our society in particular, and about whiteness, which is often seen as not having a race. And there's been more and more work to help white people see that having race is something that we've assigned to everybody in our society. But also the sense that people might see me in the abstract as a Black man who maybe has problems with the police and maybe struggles and people may not take seriously. And people assign these things to me, and yet they don't necessarily see me. They don't see me. They see, oh, there's a Black man. I bet it must be challenging for him. And that's great that they can see that, because a lot of people don't even see that. But then they don't go that further step of just saying, oh, look, there's a human being. Let me see this human being. Let me connect to this human being. So let me pause with that, because I can go on for half an hour with this. So.
Well, that was our intent, for you to go on. But
I just mean with that one point, though. But yes.
No, that makes so much sense to me. I mean, I certainly did feel that the desire to be seen as the whole complexity of who one is as a human being. Of course, that makes total sense.
I agree. And actually, we have our first question, which I'm going to jump to. And it's actually by someone we know. The Black poet who wrote Sanctuary, the Spirit of Harriet Tubman, Donna Kate Rusham, wrote the poem, This Bridge, My Back. He asks if we know that poem. I know Deborah does. It describes the use of her friendship with white people as her representative Black friends. Is that something you know? Are you familiar with it, Brian?
I'm not.
Well, I guess we have to find it and share it with you. I can't recite it, I'm afraid, but the image itself is potent, and it isn't a remarkable coincidence that is that she's brought up, given that she wrote a play that we toured in the 80s.
Right. But you know what? I was going to say, why don't we look into that? Why don't we ask another question while we're sort of looking into that?
Yeah.
And if the person who wrote this has a link, absolutely pass it on in the Q&A, and we will look at that. I want to jump in with Brian, along the lines of what we're talking about here. How does white fragility come into play here? I mean, I can't imagine that there's anyone on this that doesn't know what white fragility is now. But Robin DiAngelo, longtime author, trainer, and speaker on the role of white people in racism, defines white fragility as white people perpetuating racism by being too fragile to discuss the subject openly and honestly. And she goes on to say, without exploring what does it mean to be white, they, meaning white people, would continue to enact policies and practices intentionally, or not, that hurt and limit Black lives. It feels like there's a decent amount of white fragility around happening within, potentially within what you're writing about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great point. And it's really fascinating. One of the things I experience a lot in Cambridge, and it's not only Cambridge, but is the fact that people are aware of these concepts. They read the book White Fragility. They read other books, how to be an anti-racist, and they can recite things and explain things. And yet people, of course, just being human, fall back into the same patterns. So with the urgency that so many people feel, it's interesting because and again, now you'll find people of all races who can feel different ways about the urgency of the moment. And you'll hear people that say, well, I don't know why all of a sudden this is urgent for white people because this has been urgent for Black people for 400 years. Or who might say, well, I mean, this is how it is. So it's great that you're on board now, but okay, come on, join in with the program and catch up with us. But part of the urgency certainly is from people who are Black and who feel that, why does this keep happening? How is nothing making a difference? How is reform not working? But part of the sense of urgency, I think, is very connected to white fragility, because part of whiteness, from my perspective, is the sense of agency, the sense that, of course, we can make this happen. We can do this. We can figure out a plan. We can get from point A to point B to point C, and let's do it. And there's a piece coming out in the New York Times magazine this weekend talking about Robin DiAngelo. And one of the things she says in that piece, and I want to read it so I get it right, it's very brief, is, and this is the problem, the very urgency itself says you don't have a deep understanding of how hard this work is and how long it takes and how ongoing it needs to be. Racism is not going to go away by August. So how about we do it in August? And part of what I hear her saying is that, yes, there's an urgency, but that urgency has been here for hundreds of years. And if the need to do something, the need to be in charge, the need to be the person that makes the difference, which can do wonderful things in the world, but if that becomes the primary motivation, using the language of Black Lives Matter, or we have to follow Black leadership, and all of those things, it becomes about white people, and it becomes about white people's needs. And again, it's very hard to discern, because on the one hand, it's important for white people to take responsibility, right, for being anti-racist.
Yeah,
exactly. And you have to be very thoughtful all the time about, well, what does that mean? And why am I doing this? And what am I doing? And I don't think that people should become paralyzed by questions or fear of doing something wrong. But when you start thinking like, oh, this is the right thing to do, let me go do it. I know I'm absolutely right. I'm gonna go speak truth to power and tell them too. That's when you should slow down and question yourself.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. I mean, I do feel like there was some, white fragility sort of became, or allyship at some point in time, I feel like a few years ago, it suddenly became, I can be a better ally than you. And it did turn back around and be all about white people. It was like a competition with white people.
Yeah.
I remember at one point thinking, oh my God, no, no. That's
Right.
not what we're being told here. So I can imagine, there was, competitive people who took it to the extreme. I definitely felt that I saw that. We have a decent amount in the questions.
Mm-hmm.
I have one that's I have one from a gentleman in Canada saying, I have repeatedly said that racism is an obnoxious word. There is only one race of humans on this planet. And yet I have been criticized for saying so by those who claim we are not ready. I would love to hear what you collectively respond.
Oh, that sounds like my cousin from another family up in Toronto.
I think it is, maybe. Not trying to give any
very small
names,
side.
but
No, very small side story. Through Facebook, I don't know how many of you are this narcissistic, but you may have gone on to see if there are other people that share your name. And there's a few other Brian Corrs out there. And the brother of one of my Facebook friends and I met up last time I was in Canada and had a really great time. And but I got a similar note from him on Facebook. And I think that the challenge is really, so race is not a real thing, right? Race is not a biological reality. There's been a lot of talk about that the last couple of decades, but race is a sociological reality. So, you know, if you look at genetics, if you look at all sorts of things, even despite the fact that so much of our medical system tracks everything by race and gender and age. I mean, that's how you that's the first thing you say about someone in the medical world, right? At least traditionally. At the same, so it would be great if we could live in a world where we just said, you know what, I'm going to be colorblind. I'm not going to see race. I'm just going to treat everybody as human. But the challenge is, because it's so deeply embedded in Western society, the ideas of race, the racism that's built into everything, it's just in us. And so what we have to do is to be aware that we have these implicit biases. And we can't just make them go away because they're implicit. They're not conscious. So we have to recognize what they are, how they come up, and do our best to mitigate them. So yes, we have to treat everybody with respect and dignity. We have to do our best to approach everyone, not thinking about what race they are and how we treat them differently. And we have to know that the way we react to people, the things we say to people, how we respond to people, even nonverbal cues, all of those are impacted by the messages that we're given about race our entire lives. And that's not only about race. You can look at gender, you can look at lots of other issues, but race is a particular version of it that's very tied up in the foundation of this nation in particular, but really all of the societies that spring from Western Europe over the last few hundred years. The race was part of the conquest and the mercantilism and colonization and the world wars. It's all in there. So anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying, I would love it if one day we don't have to think about race, but as long as race is a real sociological construct that has real life implications and impacts on people, we have to be aware of it, and we have to work to mitigate the negative impacts of racism and implicit bias.
I think that right before COVID lockdown, you were going to host a screening of a film called Race, the Power of an Illusion, right? Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is
because
true.
Of that,
it was about 2 days before.
Yes. Well, because of that, I watched that film, which I will say to our audience, if that interests you, you can find it on Canopy, which I discovered because of looking for this film. It's a way of seeing films through your public library. There you go. There's a little public service announcement. Anyway, it's a great film. And I found it I'm so glad to learn about that film from you, because I found it incredibly provocative. And one of the things that it really illustrated to me in a way I had not thought about it is how perspectives on race shift. Of course they do, according to the needs of, well, according to money and power, according to right. I guess that's enough said on that, but yeah, it's a great film.
it is.
I saw you looking studiously at the screen, Kathy. Did you have another question?
Yes, I do. I have a bunch. There's one saying, great to be here with you. So many questions. The main one is, can you share some examples, this is to you, Brian, of times you have seen your colleagues and friends find a decent balance between owning privilege and using power to upend some component of systemic racism, but without making the mistakes you reference, such as taking over and designating only certain Black people as true leaders to follow? In other words, what does it look like to be a true and healthy ally, in your opinion? It's a big question.
Okay, that is a lot in there. So let me try to work on this one piece at a time. So I think I'll say one example actually involves working with Deborah Wise. So one of the things that we've worked together on is a Cambridge Haiti Sister City effort. And we've worked on it for 10 years, a perfect example of long-term work. And it's had its ups and downs with the political situation in Haiti and with our pandemic. I mean, we haven't been able to do very much the last couple of years. But for many years, we worked to build a relationship with this city in southern Haiti. And part of the beauty of it was that we intentionally built a group of people as a committee that included people who were born and raised in Haiti, people who were born and raised here but of Haitian descent, and people who were just from here, Black and white, and I guess Black and white, thinking about the racial aspect. And in that group, we developed enough trust and enough sense of community that we were able to really be honest with each other, to challenge each other, to push each other, to think differently. We could have a whole other conversation about the history of Haiti and racism and how it's a very specific example of colonialism and all these forces. But the biggest challenge I see when people from the global north, and especially the United States or France, try to work with Haiti is it's usually, oh, these poor people, it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, they have nothing. Everything we do will help them. And so people will say, oh, let's donate clothes to them. Let's find ways to build schools. And sometimes those things are helpful, but we really, and this could go on for hours. So we really had to figure out how could we support efforts going on there and support the effort of the Haitian people to do what they needed to do to make their society better, because there are tons of people in Haiti, well-educated people devoted to that. And figuring out what's our role as people from Cambridge, from the United States, from the global north, in supporting their efforts. And because we had this mix of people, we could really interrogate what we thought, what we saw. People who may have grown up there would have all sorts of insights that we might not have as people who grew up here. And they also might have some blind spots or some things. Well, this is what I always experienced. So it was beautiful in that way. And the reason I say all this in the framework of answering this question is because at the heart of what we were doing was a deeply anti-racist project. The racism that had enslaved the people who became the Haitian people, the racism that kept Haiti oppressed after it threw off slavery, the indemnity to France.
Excuse me for interrupting, but it was the first country, please. Right? The only country, I think,
yes,
in the history of the world.
Yes.
That I didn't know that until we started working together. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, that in itself is huge. We should all be learning that in schools. Sorry, please go on.
Think about that. No, I appreciate that, because if you think about, there's a real connection there, right? It's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and it was the first and only nation to throw off its enslavers, and a very powerful empire at the time, still the French Empire, right? These are the kinds of things that it's hard to really address unless you can create a group of people who come from different backgrounds, who are open about their differences, who want to listen and learn from each other, who are willing to challenge each other and be challenged. And then out of that can create something really meaningful. So to jump ahead in the story, because it's, again, too much detail for the purposes of this, what we came up with was a framework around supporting the people of this community in 3 different areas where we could add value based on their needs and the needs that they said were their needs, not what we came in and looked around and decided, oh, I think they need this. And that to me has been one of the most powerful multiracial, anti-racist experiences I've had, even with the limitations of trying to make it work from a couple 3,000 miles away and with the politics and all of that. So, and that's part of why I have such a love for the people of the Central Square Theater, because of the work we did together with things like Tijan and his brothers on traveling to Haiti with Deborah. I mean, this is really, to me, a great model of how you do this work. That's not about wearing t-shirts and standing up and proclaiming and speaking truth to power, but really getting in there and building the human relationships among your group and then going out and replicating that and building those human relationships with an awareness of race, with an awareness of class, with an awareness of history, and yet also working to transcend those divisions, those perceived lines of difference. So I'm gonna stop
Great,
there.
Brian. Thank you. And you know, that sort of long process that you talk about in creating relationships. There was a question in the Q&A about someone who was unsure of some of the terminology we were using, and she asked about allies and allyship. And so while I was listening to you, I was also checking up different definitions for it, you know, realizing that I know what this is, but I haven't actually. And this just sort of cements a little bit more what you're saying. This is from a Forbes article saying allyship is the lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. Again, that long relationship, so in it for the long term, not sort of so I think when we speak about, we're thinking about the urgency of the day, you know, and I've heard a lot of negative feedback from BIPOC friends about, you know, stop talking about this as a moment in time. You know, it's not a moment, it's a movement. It's not, you know, you woke up one day and, you know, and here it was, you know, it's not that. But in thinking about that, again, about the urgency, I think we have to be careful with urgency, especially white people who want to be allies, is you can feel an urgent need to do something. But again, I think what Brian is saying here and what a lot of my BIPOC friends are saying is, it's good that you feel urgency, but don't take away your need to act. That's like your need to act. You have to step back and be thoughtful and considerate and really look forward at how you take that action. Don't feel like you immediately need to make yourself feel better by acting. I think that's what we're hearing a lot of, and we really need to be listening to it.
So thank you. And two things. One, thinking about terminology and using allyship. BIPOC, I've actually never heard someone say it. I only ran across it about 3 weeks ago, but I think it stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, as a way to try to lift up the different experiences in this particular society of Black people, people descended from enslaved people from Africa, Indigenous people who were conquered and their land taken away and near genocide was done, and people of color, who are the other people of color who have come into this nation where we define race as Black and white. Oh, and then there's those Indians that we killed and they used to be here and now they're mascots. Oh, and there's these other people of color who, well, we're not sure if they're white or not. Maybe they will be someday. So BIPOC, it's an interesting concept. And I guess the other thing I'll just say in terms of allyship, I mean, it's a word I've only started using recently, and it is kind of a shorthand for, there's a lot of talk about being allies and how are we allies? How are we good allies? And I've experienced it mostly in work I do around making domestic and gender-based violence an issue that men are addressing. I'm part of a group here in Cambridge called Mending Cambridge. And it's supported by people from the Public Health Department, from the Women's Commission, from the city's Domestic and Gender-Based Violence Prevention Initiative. And we've worked as men to be allies to women, men and male-identified people. And we also, as part of our work, we have a couple of women who are allies to us in our work as men, working to make it a men's issue. And part of that role of being an ally is to listen and support. And depending on exactly what it is, it may be to give advice, it may be to offer critique, but it really depends. You know, in our Mending Cambridge group, because of the dominant role of men in our society, and there's more of us men, and we have the female allies, I mean, part of their role really is to say, well, wait a second, you know, when you say that, this is what I'm hearing. Or if you do that, what's going to be the impact on this? But now, if it were a different paradigm, if you're a white ally of people of color, where the white people are the dominant group in our society in that sense, you have to think about it differently. So like many things, I will say, if you think you know the answer off the top of your head, you probably should stop and step back and think about it, because it's not easy. It's not just like, oh great, I want to help Black people, I'm an ally, yay. It involves a lot of questioning, reflection, and discernment.
Thank you. We have more questions. I think this is an interesting, very sort of pragmatic question that makes me think about, I think one of the things that stood out for me in your essay, Brian, which was the personal piece of it. We have a woman that asks, I have read your essay 4 times and have tried to imagine what the family could have done differently not to have sparked the feelings in you that you describe, and I cannot. So I'm questioning that as well as questioning myself. Can you speak to this?
Sure, that's a great question. I think part of it is, as much as I care about my feelings, I want you to care about my feelings. Feelings are important. It's really less about the feelings that what they did inspired in me, and more about the fact that their actions were really about them. And so, I mean, what would shift would be that they're not so engrossed in what they're doing and their joy over look what we're doing, that they're also mindful of why they're doing it. Because I think if you're doing that and somewhere in your mind you're thinking about the Black lives that have been lost, from George Floyd all the way back to people being enslaved in Africa and everything in between. I mean, not that there can't be joy, we have to have joy, but you might be a little more aware of, oh look, and there's a Black person who's walking by and looking at me. You know, it's so in a sense it's very symbolic, but it as I think Kathy said, it's almost a metaphor for ways that this is playing out in society. And again, it's gotten a little less intense, but there were definitely, between the pandemic and the isolation and walking around and seeing Black Lives Matter everywhere I go, and yet not necessarily feeling that that has anything to do with me, right? It's about those people in their houses. It's about those people with the chalk. It's about those people who were shocked at the fact that police brutality is still taking Black lives, even though we've been talking about this since Obama was president.
Yeah. And speaking about, and before, if I understand correctly, an essay I read by Jill Lepore, I guess, in the New Yorker, about the history of commissions. The commissions studying this problem from, I don't know, the turn of like 1900.
Yeah, the turn of the last century, like 1903. Yes.
Yeah, right. And basically coming up with the same descriptions of the root problems. Well, speaking of, since you brought up the police, and I know that there's at least, with my glasses off, I can still see there's at least one question having to do with the Cambridge police here. And I was just wondering about this issue of urgency, if you don't mind. I'm certainly guilty of feeling like there's this moment, sorry, it feels very powerful, this moment, in the sense of, oh, we're looking at this thing. We're looking at this problem. There have been all these commissions, right? We're looking at this problem now. How can it be different? I mean, there's a fear that I have heard articulated. Now I brought this up to you, in fact, that I've heard some folks articulate, that will we pass through this period of time and without any real change to the police department? So without, putting on the spot and getting down to brass tacks, I just kind of wonder, I mean, that feels urgent, but I'm not sure it's an urgency that at this moment I want to, like, anyway, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, no, that's I think you're just, even the way that you're talking about is part of what is happening now. We'll just say now, then we can avoid the moment thing temporarily. So a few things. As many of you who are on this probably know me personally, so people who don't know, or you know now, that I also do work nationally on civilian oversight. That came up in the intro. And so I have this interesting perspective because I live and work here in Cambridge. I do civilian oversight of the police department. I really get to see a lot of what happens, and I've seen this in my time in this work. The changes that have been made since the arrest of Professor Henry Louis Gates on his front porch, which is a whole other story and is actually much more complicated than many people realize. My take on it is that was about class as much as about race. Working class white guy and an African-American man who grew up in segregated West Virginia, who has risen to some of the highest levels of society in this interesting interaction. So I'll say that. But the Cambridge Police Department has done a ton of work because most of the problems that we saw in Cambridge in terms of complaints were about behavior, people who felt that they were disrespected. We thankfully weren't seeing, use of force issues, officer-involved shootings, like many of my colleagues around the country that do civilian oversight. So in Cambridge, there's a certain situation. Again, not perfect, and people have lots of critiques that go into deep structural issues. Whereas if you look at policing around the country, I mean, it's all over the place. There are 18,000 different law enforcement agencies around the United States. And there's this interesting, there are these two different narratives right now that are going past each other. One narrative, which is the traditional narrative, is that policing came out of England, and Sir Robert Peel in 1829 created the Metropolitan Police Department in London, and the police are the public and the public are the police. And you'll hear a lot of police departments talk about this, police trainers, and I will say that is absolutely true. It's not untrue. And you hear a lot of people talk about slave catching, the slave patrols, the slave patroller's oath. And people will say that that's where policing comes from, not just in the South, but in the North. And the famous poster of Boston warning colored men about the slave patrols, that's true as well, but they're both true. And so we have this interesting, like everything else, very complicated history. If someone tells you, from my point of view, it's a very simple narrative. Policing is racist, it comes from slave catching, boom. Or policing is about the community, it comes from London, boom. It's not accurate. And it's a lot easier if we know the answer and it's simple and, oh, it's this. So having kind of said that as a little bit of a platform, I would say that policing in this country has a lot of huge problems, and a lot of it has to do with the problems of our country. Violence and militarism. It's not just in the police. There's a lot of talk about militarization of the police, and people think it's driven by extra military hardware. It's driven by a paramilitary structure. It's driven by a society where most people love to watch sports and they like to watch the pregame and postgame shows, and you could be talking about battles. It's all a military metaphor. It's all about war and battles and who won. And if you listen to people covering the presidential campaigns, it's a little different right now, but during the primary season, everything was like a battle and a war, and who's ahead today and who won this. And anyway, it's so deeply embedded in our society that if we only look at the police, which we have to look at, I mean, deadly force, right? I mean, these are people who are given weapons, and as we know, it's pretty difficult for most juries or judges to find police officers guilty of murder. Not that it never happens, and there's all sorts of legal reasons and all that, but it rarely happens, and we all know that. At the same time, there's a lot of talk, I think a very important discussion about defunding the police, which can mean anything from cutting as a symbolic move to dismantling and abolishing policing and finding alternate ways of governing our society. So what I would say ultimately is that I think this is an important moment. There is a movement that's ongoing. And my greatest fear myself is not that, we'll go past this moment, nothing will happen, but that there'll be such a push for such radical changes that some places it'll happen, it'll work. Other places it will stall out, and that what changes do happen will be seen as insufficient. And I think ultimately one of the challenges it's not, the roots don't go back as far as militarism and racism and materialism and poverty in this society. But the right wing has been very successful over the last 50 years at convincing people that government doesn't work, that government is a problem, that government is oppressive, And many people who I care deeply about and I have great relationships with and I respect have, in a certain sense, bought into that argument. And it's coming from a more left perspective, but the idea that government doesn't work, it's broken, it's corrupt, it's bought off. I mean, and so that's not what I believe. I mean, partly I work for government, but I work for government because I believe in government. I don't believe in government because I work for government. As an African-American man, government has done things in this country that were terrible and oppressed me and oppressed my ancestors. And at the same time, I would not have what I have. I would not be able to do the work I do. I would not be able to live as a relative equal in the society without government action tied with the action of activism. And that's, I think, the important thing. It's not that activism makes government make the change, but activism and government together, the classic inside-outside strategy, can make change. So to go back to your question after 10 minutes here, what I hope is that we have some serious conversations about what is public safety? What does public safety look like? It's one thing to say, oh, we shouldn't have police do this, we should have social workers do it. Have social workers show up if there's a domestic violence call. I have yet to talk to a social worker who says, I want to go to that call. There are lots of things that are much more complicated. And so if we can come to understand what are our needs and what's our vision of a safe, just, and peaceful society, then we can look at how do we create systems of governance that allow us to make that so. I think that if we try in this urgent sense of people are dying at the hands of the police, we have to do something because nothing has happened yet, we will end up with what we think are solutions, but instead actually just force the system to move in different ways. And then 10 years from now, people will be saying the same thing. There was this movement, we had such high hopes, and nothing has changed. The last thing I'll say is often it's not that reform fails, it's that reform fails to meet expectations. Because I'm a reformer, right? I mean, not that revolution is never useful or good, but revolutions have lots of unintended consequences and often don't work out well for the common people. So from my perspective, I believe that we can make serious, deep reforms in the structure of policing and other parts of our governance as a society that can really create more equity for people, more sense of possibility, and really treat people in the way that their humanity demands, that people are treated as fully human. And I think that is a long-term project. I mean, how many hundreds of years did it take for the United States to get to where we are, good and bad? If you think about the history of Western Europe, how long is the trajectory that that part of the continent has been on that has gotten to the place now where the European Union may fall apart into a series of nations that might go to war again? I mean, these things go on for hundreds of years, and change takes a long time, even as it's urgent. So yes, change can't wait, but sustainable change takes time.
Write that down.
I know. You can definitely quote him on that. Thank you. Well said. And I think you just answered a bunch of questions with that. So someone asked about how you feel about defunding the police. You talked about that. Someone asked if you feel hopeful about, this moment is a movement. And I think that, and I think you answered some of that because I think you're inherently a hopeful person, which is probably what makes you really good at much of the activist work that you do. And this person expressed concern about how do we all make sure that this moment of truly naming and owning systemic racism doesn't pass. And that's, I guess, too, in what you said, speaks to the urgent need as well as the long-term need. And that we're having these conversations now.
Yeah. And again, I'll just add quickly, I've mentioned this in passing, but I personally think if we were not living through a pandemic, it wouldn't be what it is. It's just the combination of living through the presidential administration, living through a pandemic and the seeming never-ending abuse of people of color, not just by the police, but by the police. And so we are in a sense in a moment, because this constellation of things will never be quite the same. There may be other things, there may be some of the same things, but we have to make sure that as we go through this period, we are really being thoughtful about how we make change, and that we're really doing our best to listen to all voices. I mean, I'm so glad to have this platform and to have you amplifying my voice and giving me a chance to pontificate at great length. And I think it comes out of a real relationship, so I feel okay about it. I don't feel like I'm violating what I talked about in my piece. But at the same time, I think that we need to have more and more conversations like this.
Yeah.
For a long time, I was very skeptical about people live in the blue bubbles and the red bubbles, but I have to say I'm coming around. I'm coming around to seeing that really is the case for a lot of people. And so, just in terms of people listening, if you're a Republican, you only listen to Republicans, and Facebook shows you Republican posts, and if you're progressive, and all that sort of thing. And there's some truth, there is some real truth to it I'm seeing. And I think it's less about people being afraid to hear different voices, but it's more, there's so much information now. And just over the last 20 years, the ways in which we communicate and we take in information is so different. I mean, even in this event, right? Oh, if you send me a link, we can look it up and then we can comment on it. I mean, we think that's normal. The fact that we're able to do this, and I'm sitting in my house and you're sitting in your house, and there are people sitting in their houses, we're having this conversation. I mean, it's amazing. And at the same time, there's so much work around it. There's so much effort to go find things you want to read, to look at links, to search things out. There's so much more information. It's not like when I was a kid and it's like, well, are we going to watch ABC, CBS, or NBC News tonight? Or I was from Detroit. Maybe we'll watch the CBC and find out what the Canadians are saying. But that was it. And I actually think that that's part of what has changed, is the way we approach information, the way we get information to and from other people, the way we share things. And we just get immersed in these worlds, which can be fascinating and powerful. It's part of the beauty of reading a book or watching a movie or seeing a play. And at the same time, if that's how we're living our lives, it takes away space from all sorts of other things. It takes away space from conversations we might have with people who don't share our interests, who, if we just, again, people that know me know I'm very passionate about finding ways for those of us who live in Cambridge to actually get to know each other, because you can live in the city of Cambridge for years and know tons of people all over the city and around the world and not really know the people that live on your block. And
Absolutely.
so I think that this is part of what the challenge is for our society, is how do we find ways to connect with those people who are near us and around us, but because of our work, because of our affiliations, because of our internet, we don't really have to deal with.
Yeah. I used to feel when our kids were in school, in public school, I used to feel like, God, thank God for public school, because in public school, I felt like it was easy to meet folks.
Yeah, it's a great equalizer. We have a couple other questions. This one is interesting and speaks about young people. I know, Ryan, you work with students at the high school, Cambridge Rindge and Latin. Do you see generational differences in internalized bias?
Generational differences in internalized bias. Well, and I don't do that much with young people at this point at the high school. I do more with faculty and teachers and staff, or faculty and staff. But I guess so. If we can define young people as not just high school, but so outside of my work life, I do a lot of volunteering and political things. And on one of the campaigns I worked on over the last year, I was just so amazed by the younger people. And these are people, like 18 to 25. And certainly there's lots of wisdom I think I bring, and experience and knowledge as an organizer. And it was great to work with young people who were interested in what I had to say and had all sorts of other things to say and taught me, and it was powerful and respectful. And I think that, so back to the question, I think there are some differences, but I don't know if it's in implicit bias. I think those biases still exist because we haven't shifted our paradigm as a society about race and class and gender, and I could go on and on, but these are things that are deeply embedded in the United States and our culture and our society. But what I would say is, so it's not in the implicit bias, but it's a difference in an expectation that they will be with and around people who have different values, who have different backgrounds. And when I say different values, not who are, I am a right wing, blah, 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 and you're a left wing, blah, 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 but who come from small towns, who come from cities, who are immigrants, who are very out and queer, who are, very religious and traditional. And they all can come together and work and for a common cause. So it's, I don't know, it's kind of a rambling answer, but I would say that I do find that people who are like 25 and younger have a really different sense of, it's not intersectionality. I'm trying to find the right word, but they have a really different sense of how you can just be with a whole bunch of other people and be connected, even if you don't agree on everything. I mean, there's limits, and younger people tend to have a little less tolerance. I remember I had a lot less tolerance when I was younger of people who thought differently from me. But if people can share basic values, and it allows people to be more connected. And let me step back and say it in a little different way. I think most of the younger people I've met have a much closer core of shared values around humanity and equality than older people. And that's probably what I should have said at the very beginning of trying to answer this question. But there's a different sensibility about how we're all in this together, even if we don't all agree. And that to me is pretty powerful.
That's hopeful.
Good.
Oh, that's funny. We're always looking for hope, right, Deborah?
Yeah, you better believe it. Yeah.
Gotta find the hope. We have, let's see, how are we doing for time? So we have about 2 more minutes. We have a question here that that hits close to home, I think, for Central Square Theater. And the question is, Brian, how do you feel you can help Deborah and Kathy bring a person of color into the leadership of Central Square Theater in the near future? I have some things to say, but let Brian.
You mean besides me? No, I guess
exactly.
I mean, there is the board.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm guessing, I'm intuiting that they mean because the tri-leadership, which is the 2 artistic directors and myself, staff leadership, are white people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm going to go back to something I've said for decades, which is that I think in some ways, the best way to bring in people of color is to have people of color who are really part of and connected to the institution. And so it's interesting because Central Square Theater, like many institutions, it's still kind of relatively founder-led, right? So we have these individuals who, along with many other people, had a vision, have certain roles, spearheading things, making things happen, and it's great. And as I've seen the development of this theater over the last decade or more now, I guess, I have seen people come in as youth underground, as young actors, as people who are working on educating the young people, as people who are involved in as playwrights and all the other pieces that you have in the theater. And it's a pretty diverse group. And so what my experience tells me is that over time, and again, it is kind of a long-term thing, as the organization continues to grow, as the programs continue to evolve, Just as you're seeing on the board, you see more and more people of color, more and more people who aren't, white, middle class, upper middle class, educated people who are coming into this world of the Central Square Theater. And then as there are more and more people come. So that's the piece about sort of a welcoming environment. And it's very important. And I think a lot of times, a lot of us, and I say a lot of us, I mean a lot of us, I don't just mean white people, get it wrong. If you've ever had an experience, and some of you may have, may not, as a Black person, I did a few times, you walk into, say, a church or something, or some organization or some event, people are like, oh, hi, oh, what's your name? Oh, come on, it's so nice to meet you. And it's, I mean, it doesn't make me feel bad. It's just like, oh, here we go again. I guess I must be a rarity. And people are trying to be welcoming, and it's not really the best way, but there's a whole welcoming piece. And then the second part, to answer the question, I'll say quickly because I'm going over 8 o'clock, is it is about being intentional about not just bringing people up and putting people in positions. It's about training people. It's about changing vision. It's about being flexible. It's about creating new structures. And I would say a parallel is that one of the conversations we have in the municipal government of Cambridge is, how do we reach people? Because as everybody knows, you have a public meeting, like the top 10 people who are going to be there because they come to everything. You probably have a pretty good sense of what they're going to say because you've heard them say it before. And this is true in public meetings of the city council. It's true at events at schools, potlucks. I mean, and we don't have time to get into all why that is, although I bet people can guess. But the challenge is, if we say, okay, well, we tried to have a public meeting and we had childcare and we publicized it in all these different ways, and the NAACP sponsored it, and still it was the same 50 people and there were 2 Black people, and those are the Black people that always show up at everything anyway. Then we have to think about, well, why do we think this is the way to do things? Why do we think this is the way to have conversations? Why do we think that it's welcoming for everybody to have a situation where the person who is most willing to stand up and raise their hand and go to the mic and stand and wait is the person who should speak? And that's just a small example. But so I think the bigger question is, as Central Square Theater continues to grow and evolve, as the programs continue, as more and more people are part of that community, how is it that Central Square Theater will evolve and change so that it is broader and more accommodating, and so that the leadership of a very diverse set of people, not just white people and people of color, but a broad diversity of people, really takes root and helps it continue to be more and more of an institution that's not simply in Cambridge or even of Cambridge, but is really an institution that is essential to who Cambridge is as a city. And I think when you get to that kind of place, that's when you see people really be included. It's a radical inclusion. So it's a lot deeper, and this will surprise you. It's a lot more complicated than just lifting up people and putting people in positions.
Right.
But I think we can get there.
And
I agree. Deborah,
okay.
Just thinking that we're a little bit over, and I think the way that Brian has left it is right on.
I agree. So I was going to say that to our audience. I'm sorry. I see now. I put my glasses on. I see that your name is next to this paragraph. Well, I'll begin it, and then you can take the rest of it. It's collaboration, right? So I just think we would like our audience, that person who wrote that question and everybody else who's been writing questions, know that we are in deep conversations at Central Square Theater, not only about what we put on our stage, but how we do the work we do, and leadership and change and all the things that Brian said so articulately. I really hope this is being taped. We've been talking about that, and we would love to continue these conversations with you. If you care about Cambridge, if you care about theater in Cambridge, we hope that you'll be involved. And if you have comments or questions inspired by this or other things, I really hope that you'll email them to.
You can email them to me, cck@centralsquaretheater.org. We spell theater E-R for people to remember. A couple people asked us also about in the chat about how to get this. This is being recorded. You can get this on our Facebook page, Central Square Theater. We will also put it on our website tomorrow. So if you want to share it or you revisit it yourself, you can certainly do that. So we'll close by saying thank you to Brian. And I'm just wondering, are you an aspiring essayist now? Is that what you're going to add to your formidable resume?
You know, I can neither confirm nor deny any rumors about the future writing career are greatly exaggerated. No, in all seriousness, you know, I find I give a lot of talks, I do a lot of presentations. I often have very detailed written notes that I kind of half ignore, but I don't generally write things that I think, oh, I can put this up and people can just read it. And I was really just inspired by a few different things to write the first piece, and the second piece, which we didn't really talk about, but I hope everyone does read, came from people asking me, well, how do you choose who to follow and who not to follow? So I think if I have more thoughts, they may show up on my Medium page, and then I can say, oh yes, it was published on Medium like everybody else does. But I think really the way you're going to hear from me is probably more talks and lectures and speaking at events. And but I have to admit that it's like, maybe I should take some of these other things I've written and pull out pieces and post them on the internet so other people can read them and share them, because I got a lot of positive feedback, and that's always a nice thing in this life.
Connection.
Nice. Right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Deborah. And thanks to everyone for being on. And stay tuned. There's more coming your way. So take care, everyone.
Good night.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night.